The Airy was not a restaurant. It was a statement. Perched 75 stories above the glittering asphalt veins of New York City, it was a glass cage for the gods of finance and industry. The air itself seemed different up here, thinner and cleaner, scrubbed of the city's grit and smelling faintly of old money, rare truffles, and an ambition so sharp it could cut glass. Floor-to-ceiling windows presented the metropolis not as a home to millions, but as a conquered map, a glittering prize for the men and women who dined within. The low, confident murmur of conversations about mergers and acquisitions formed a constant hum, punctuated only by the delicate chime of silver cutlery against fine porcelain. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling like frozen constellations, their light catching the diamonds on wrists and the perfectly polished surfaces of $1,000 shoes. It was a world of calculated power, and moving through it was a young woman who had become an expert in the art of being invisible. Her name was Alara Vance, and her world was a universe away from the one she served. Alara moved with an economy of motion that bordered on spectral. Her black uniform was a void against the restaurant's shimmering opulence, allowing her to glide between tables, refilling water glasses and clearing plates with a practiced, silent grace. To the patrons, she was less a person and more a function, a pair of hands that appeared when needed and vanished when not. But beneath this veneer of professional servitude, a storm of memory and purpose raged. Every perfectly plated dish she carried, every bottle of vintage wine she presented, was a stark reminder of the life that had been stolen from her. The weight of the silver tray in her hands was nothing compared to the crushing weight of her father's medical bills, a relentless monthly invoice of $4,200 for the specialized care he required. He, a man who once commanded rooms with his brilliant architectural vision, now struggled to form sentences, his mind and body imprisoned by the aftermath of a catastrophic stroke, a direct consequence of financial and professional ruin. Alara's presence in this temple of wealth was not a career, it was a penance, a nightly pilgrimage into the world that had broken her family, all to keep the last, flickering light of her father's life from being extinguished. Her mind was a fortress no one at the Airy could ever breach. While her body performed the mundane rituals of a waitress, her thoughts were soaring through complex legal frameworks and architectural schematics. She possessed an eidetic memory, a gift inherited from her father, and a mind once honed to be the sharpest legal instrument in her class at Yale Law School. Her specialization was as unique as it was profound: historical property rights and architectural law. She could look at the grand, imposing structure of the skyscraper she now worked in and mentally deconstruct it, seeing the hidden network of steel girders, the precise calculations of wind shear resistance, the labyrinth of HVAC systems and forgotten service corridors. She saw buildings not as static objects, but as living histories, filled with legal precedents, structural secrets, and hidden vulnerabilities. This knowledge was her secret inheritance, a map of the world that only she could read, a silent, powerful weapon she carried inside her while serving champagne to people who would never even bother to learn her name. The delicate equilibrium of the restaurant shifted when Alistair Finch arrived. It was not a grand entrance, but a subtle conquering of space. The air itself seemed to defer to him, the ambient chatter dipping for a moment as he was led to the best table in the house, the one with the most commanding view of the city he seemed to own. Finch was a man sculpted from predatory instinct and bespoke tailoring. His suit was a dark, expensive armor, his movements precise and economical, conveying a sense of absolute control. He did not look at the staff, he looked through them. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, scanned the room with a dismissive air, cataloging assets and dismissing anything or anyone he deemed irrelevant. The maitre d', a man who prided himself on his composure, bowed slightly lower for Finch, his professional smile tightening at the edges. Alara felt a familiar cold knot form in her stomach. She had served men like him before, men who radiated a casual cruelty, who saw the world as their personal chessboard, and everyone else as pawns to be sacrificed. Finch was dining with a potential investor, a slightly nervous man who seemed eager to please. Alara approached their table to pour water, her movements fluid and unobtrusive, but her senses were on high alert. Finch's voice was a low, confident rumble, slicing through the restaurant's genteel ambiance with the sharp edges of corporate jargon. He spoke of hostile takeovers as if they were a noble art form, of liquidating assets and dismantling companies with a chilling lack of emotion. He was weaving a narrative of power, casting himself as the visionary, the titan who could see value where others saw only sentiment. He gestured dismissively toward the city below them. He wasn't admiring the view, he was assessing his inventory. To him, the historic buildings and vibrant neighborhoods were not cultural treasures but undervalued properties, ripe for acquisition and redevelopment. Alara poured the chilled water into his crystal goblet, her hand steady, her face a perfect mask of professional neutrality, all while the man's casual disdain for the world she and her father cherished settled like a layer of frost over her heart. The main course had been cleared, and Finch, in a grand gesture of performative dominance for his guest, unrolled a large, aged blueprint across the pristine white tablecloth. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, depicting the intricate design of a beloved city landmark, a building known for its unique, century-old facade. Finch tapped a manicured finger on the blueprint, a smirk playing on his lips. He began to loudly mock the design, his voice dripping with condescension. He called its foundational principles antiquated, its aesthetic hopelessly sentimental, a relic that was impeding his grand vision for a modern, more profitable city block. He scoffed at the intricate details, dismissing them as inefficient and obsolete. Then he delivered the line that pierced through Alara's carefully constructed composure, the words that would unknowingly seal his fate. He looked at the drawing and laughed, a short, ugly sound. The idiot architect who designed this, he declared, probably thought it would stand forever. The insult, so casually delivered, landed in Alara's soul like a physical blow. The term idiot architect echoed in the silent chambers of her memory, colliding with the vibrant image of her father, a man whose passion for his craft was the sun around which her entire childhood had orbited. It was in that precise moment that Alistair Finch made his fatal error. He looked up, his cold eyes finally registering her presence as she stood poised to refill his water glass. He saw not a person, but an opportunity to further demonstrate his superiority. A cruel, calculating smirk spread across his face. He gestured toward the complex drawing with a flick of his wrist. "I bet you couldn't even tell me where the service elevator is," he said, his voice loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear, let alone the structural flaws in this relic. The question hung in the air, a deliberate act of humiliation designed to reinforce the chasm between his world and hers. The investor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, a silent witness to a cruelty that served no purpose other than to amuse the powerful. For a long, suspended moment, Alara did not move. The world around her seemed to slow down, the clinking of glasses and the low hum of conversation fading into a distant roar. The weight of the silver water pitcher in her hand felt immense, an anchor holding her to a reality she was suddenly prepared to shatter. The face of her father, gaunt and tired in his hospital bed, flashed behind her eyes. His hands, once capable of creating beauty and strength from mere lines on paper, now trembled as they reached for a glass of water. Finch's insult was not just an attack on a long-dead architect, it was a desecration of her father's life, of his legacy, of the very principles he had instilled in her. The dull ache of exhaustion and grief that had been her constant companion for years began to recede, replaced by something else entirely. It was not a hot, reckless anger, but a cold, dense fury, a block of ice forming in her chest. It steadied her, sharpened her senses, and brought the world into crystalline focus. Her breathing became slow and controlled. The waitress was gone. In her place stood a Yale law prodigy, and she was about to answer the question. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. We're about to witness the moment an invisible woman finds her voice in the heart of New York City. But first, We'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your city or country below, and if you believe in the power of hidden knowledge and righteous justice, make sure you subscribe to join our community. You are about to see how a single, underestimated woman can dismantle an empire with nothing more than the truth, and the battle begins right now, in the gilded cage of the Eyrie, 75 stories above the city that holds all their secrets. The air is thick with unspoken history and imminent collapse, a silence stretching taut between the arrogant titan and the woman he so foolishly dismissed. She placed the heavy silver water pitcher on a nearby serving stand with a soft, deliberate click that seemed to echo in the sudden, expectant silence. The sound was a period, an end to a sentence of servitude she had been living for 3 long years. Her movements, once designed for invisibility, became precise and economical, yet imbued with a newfound gravity. She straightened her back, not with defiance, but with the quiet, unshakable posture of an expert taking the stage. The subtle shift was seismic. Her shoulders, which had been perpetually curved in a posture of deference, now squared, creating a line of authority that was utterly incongruous with her simple black uniform. The nervous energy that had once filled the space around her, the energy of a servant trying to remain unnoticed, dissipated, replaced by an aura of profound and unnerving calm. The entire restaurant seemed to be holding its breath, the diners at nearby tables pausing their conversations, forks hovering mid-air, drawn in by the invisible shift in the room's power dynamic. Alistair Finch watched her, his smirk faltering for the first time, a flicker of confusion crossing his features as he tried to reconcile the subservient waitress from a moment ago with the composed woman who now stood before him, her gaze level and direct. Her voice, when it came, was not the hushed, polite tone of a service worker. It was clear, measured, and carried a resonance that cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant with the precision of a scalpel. It held no trace of anger, no hint of nervousness, only the serene confidence of absolute certainty. "The service elevator you're looking for, Mr. Finch, isn't on this blueprint," she began, her eyes fixed on the aged drawing spread across the table. Her words were simple, yet they landed with the weight of a judicial ruling. She did not raise her voice, but it commanded the attention of everyone within earshot. It was a voice that belonged in a courtroom or a lecture hall, a voice accustomed to dissecting complex truths and presenting them as undeniable fact. The investor leaned forward slightly, his expression a mixture of surprise and intrigue. Finch's eyes narrowed, a silent warning to her to stop, to retreat back into the role he had assigned her. But Alara was no longer playing a role. She had shed the uniform in spirit, if not in fabric, and was now operating entirely within her own domain of expertise, a world of architectural secrets he had foolishly invited her into. She extended a single, steady finger, not to touch the fragile document, but to hover just above a specific section on the left wing of the building's schematic. "That's because the original freight elevator, which I believe is what you mean, was decommissioned in 1978, following the city's updated fire code regulations. It was sealed off during the renovation of the mezzanine level. However," she continued, her voice unwavering, "there are 3 undocumented access points. One is behind the western boiler in the sub-basement, a detail omitted from the public filings to discourage vagrancy. Another is accessible through a maintenance panel in the 3rd-floor janitorial closet, disguised as a circuit breaker box. The third," she paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a beat, "was a private dumbwaiter shaft built for the original owner. Its entrance is concealed behind a false wall in the pantry of what is now your executive suite on the 40th floor." She recited these facts with the effortless recall of someone reading from a book that only she possessed. Each detail was a perfectly aimed dart, striking the foundation of his smug superiority. As she spoke, the image of her father filled her mind, not as the frail man in the hospital bed, but as he was years ago, his face animated with passion as they sat surrounded by blueprints in his home office. He had taught her that buildings were more than just steel and glass. They were living documents, filled with stories, secrets, and legal histories written into their very foundations. He had shown her how to read them, how to see the ghost of a walled-off staircase, how to find the legal loophole in a century-old property deed. Every fact she now recited was a piece of him, a fragment of the knowledge he had so lovingly passed down to her. This was his voice speaking through her, his legacy being wielded as a weapon against the very man who had tried to erase it. The cold fury in her chest was now a focused beam of energy, channeling years of suppressed grief and love into this single, transformative moment. She was not just defending a building, she was defending her father's entire life, his brilliance, his very soul, from the casual desecration of an ignorant tyrant. The investor's eyebrows had climbed high on his forehead. He was no longer looking at Finch for cues. He was captivated by Alara. Finch, for his part, was turning a dangerous shade of red, a slow, creeping flush of anger that started at his collar and rose to his temples. His attempt to reassert control was clumsy, a blunt instrument against her surgical precision. "That's quite enough," he snapped, his voice a low growl. "I don't know what kind of party trick this is, but you're dismissed." He waved a hand at her, the same dismissive gesture he'd used before, but this time it lacked its intended effect. It was the desperate motion of a king, realizing his crown was made of paper. But Alara did not move. She simply held his gaze, her expression unreadable, and continued as if he hadn't spoken at all. "You also mentioned structural flaws. You are correct that the original riveted steel frame presents certain challenges for modern retrofitting, but you fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the core vulnerability." Her calm refusal to be dismissed was a more profound act of defiance than any shouted insult could ever be. It was a complete negation of his power. Her words became more technical, a cascade of information that left both men struggling to keep up. "The primary flaw isn't in the vertical load-bearing capacity of the original A36 steel columns, which you've incorrectly identified as the main issue. The true risk lies in the shear stress points at the junction of the 1928 structure and the 1985 cantilevered addition. The expansion joints were improperly sealed with a since-discontinued polymer that has a coefficient of thermal expansion completely incompatible with the modern curtain wall you plan to install." She spoke of tensile strengths, wind load calculations, and seismic vulnerabilities with an authority that was absolute and terrifying. She was mentally walking through the building's skeleton, pointing out every hairline fracture, every hidden weakness, every shortcut taken by contractors long dead. She was exposing the building's secrets with the same ease that Finch exposed and dismantled companies, but her purpose was not destruction. It was the revelation of a truth he was too arrogant to see. Finch's face was now a mask of incredulous fury. The blood had drained from it, leaving his skin a waxy, pale color. He looked from Alara to his investor, whose expression had morphed from intrigue to genuine alarm. This wasn't a party trick. This was a multi-million-dollar demolition of his entire investment thesis, being carried out by a waitress. He opened his mouth to speak, to call for the manager, for security, for anyone who could make this woman and her impossible knowledge disappear, but no sound came out. He was a man who controlled boardrooms and swayed markets with the power of his voice, and in this moment, he had been rendered completely mute. He was trapped at his own table, in his own restaurant, 75 stories in the air, a prisoner of the very details he had always deemed beneath his notice. The hunter had become the hunted, cornered not by a rival but by a ghost from a world he never even knew existed. And then, Alara delivered the final devastating blow. "But the structural issues are, frankly, the least of your problems, Mr. Finch." She finally lowered her gaze back to the blueprint, her voice softening into an almost sympathetic tone which only made her words more brutal. "The true flaw in your plan is not in the steel, but in the law. Specifically, in the 1973 amendment to the New York City Landmark Preservation Code, Section 25 to 307B, which grants automatic and inalienable air rights protection to any structure that shares a foundational wall with a designated historical landmark. The building you are trying to acquire," she said, her finger now tracing a line on the blueprint that connected it to an adjacent, much smaller, historic building, shares a 3-foot-thick granite foundation wall with the Old City Archive, a protected landmark since 1968. A legal fact your team of highly paid lawyers somehow missed. She had built a fortress of facts around him, and this was the final, unbreachable wall. The implications of her statement settled over the table like a shroud. The air rights were the most valuable part of the acquisition. Without them, Finch's plan to build a new, larger tower on the site was impossible. The entire 9-figure deal he had been constructing was not just flawed, it was completely void. The land was worthless for his purposes. The century-old building he had mocked was not a relic to be torn down. It was a legal fortress, and its antiquated design was the very source of its invincibility. Ilara had just revealed that he was about to pour hundreds of millions of dollars into a financial black hole. She had not only answered his question about the service elevator, she had systematically dismantled his reputation, his business acumen, and his entire grand vision in front of the very man he was trying to impress. The arrogance that had been his defining feature had evaporated, replaced by the raw, ugly shock of total and utter humiliation. The silence that followed was profound. It was the silence of a chessboard after a sudden, unexpected checkmate. The investor slowly, deliberately, pushed his chair back from the table. He folded his napkin and placed it beside his plate, a gesture of finality. He looked at Finch, then at Ilara, a flicker of something that looked like respect in his eyes. He stood up, gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod to Ilara, and walked away without a single word, leaving Alistair Finch alone at the table with the ruins of his deal and the woman who had just destroyed him. The delicate chime of cutlery against porcelain, the murmur of distant conversations, all of it seemed to rush back in, but the spell was broken. The god in the glass cage had been revealed as a mere mortal, and his fall from grace had been witnessed by all. Finch's world had been turned upside down, not by a corporate rival or a market crash, but by the quiet words of a woman he hadn't even considered a person. Finally, Alistair Finch found his voice. It was not the confident rumble of a titan of industry, but a low, venomous hiss ragged with fury. It was the sound of a predator wounded, lashing out in pain and disbelief. He didn't look at Ilara. He couldn't. Instead, his eyes darted around the room, searching for a target, for someone to blame, for a way to reclaim his shattered authority. He raised a single, trembling finger and beckoned the maitre d', who scurried over, his face a mask of professional concern that did little to hide his terror. Finch's voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried the chilling weight of a death sentence. "Get her out of here," he breathed, the words tight with suppressed rage. "Get her out of my sight, she is fired." He spoke the words as if they were a magic incantation that could undo the last 5 minutes, that could erase the humiliation and restore the order of his world. The manager, a man named Mr. Dubois, who prided himself on running a seamless operation, looked from Finch's contorted face to Ilara's serene expression. He saw the end of his career in Finch's eyes. He approached Ilara, his steps hesitant, his apology already forming on his lips. "Ilara, I'm so sorry. Mr. Finch is the owner of the building. My hands are tied." His words were a formality, a quiet confirmation of what she already knew. The powerful man had been humiliated, and the powerless woman had to pay the price. It was the oldest story in the book. As he gently guided her toward the staff exit, a path that would take her past several tables of now silent and staring patrons, she felt a strange sense of calm. This was not a defeat. It was a necessary consequence, a tactical sacrifice. She had drawn his fire, and in doing so she had confirmed his identity. She walked through the opulent dining room, her head held high. The journey felt 1,000 miles long. She could feel the curious and pitying stares of the diners, the whispers that erupted in her wake. She was no longer invisible. She was a spectacle, the waitress who had dared to speak out of turn, the woman who had committed the unforgivable sin of knowing more than the man in charge. But inside, her mind was a quiet sanctuary. She was not thinking of the lost job or the looming medical bills. She was thinking of her father's hands, the way they used to sketch elegant lines on drafting paper, the way they now struggled to hold a spoon. This walk of shame was not for her. It was an act of defiance on his behalf, a public declaration that his knowledge, his legacy, would not be mocked and discarded. She was carrying his honor out of this room, and it was a burden she was proud to bear. As she reached the door leading to the kitchens, Finch's voice cut through the air one last time, sharp and cruel, meant for her and everyone else to hear. "People like you," he snarled, finally looking directly at her, his eyes burning with a hatred that was almost primal, should learn their place. The insult was meant to be the final nail in her coffin, a reminder of the rigid hierarchy he believed in, where she was nothing more than a servant who had forgotten her station. But the words had the opposite effect. They did not wound her, they solidified her resolve. They were the words of a weak man, a man who had no defense against the truth other than to pull rank and inflict pain. They confirmed that she had struck a nerve, that she had found the hollow core beneath his expensive suit and arrogant demeanor. She gave him no reaction, simply meeting his gaze for a final fleeting moment before disappearing through the swinging doors. The cacophony of the kitchen, the clatter of pans, the hiss of the grill, the shouts of the chefs, was a jarring transition from the tense silence of the dining room. She walked through the chaotic ballet of the back of house, a ghost in a world that was no longer hers. In the cramped, gray locker room, the reality of her situation began to sink in. The adrenaline that had sustained her began to fade, replaced by a cold wave of dread. She had lost her job. The $4,200 for her father's care was due in 2 weeks. How would she pay it? For a moment, the crushing weight of her responsibilities threatened to suffocate her. The triumph of her confrontation with Finch seemed a hollow victory in the face of the stark, unforgiving mathematics of her life. She had won a battle of wits, but she was now on the verge of losing the war for her family's survival. The despair was a physical thing, a cold knot in her stomach that tightened with each passing second. As she was gathering her few belongings from her locker, a worn paperback, a spare set of comfortable shoes, a photo of her and her father from happier times, she heard Finch's voice again, muffled but distinct, coming from a nearby service corridor. He was on his phone, his voice no longer a hiss but a furious roar, tearing into someone on the other end. How did we miss it? How did a team of 6-figure attorneys miss a landmark bylaw? I pay you to be meticulous. His rage was a raw, uncontrolled force. He was pacing, a caged animal, his composure completely gone. Alara froze, her hand hovering over her locker door, every instinct telling her to listen. This was not just the ranting of a defeated man. This was an opportunity, a glimpse behind the curtain. And then he said the words that changed everything. The entire acquisition of the Vance Designs portfolio was predicated on those air rights. Do you have any idea how much exposure this gives us? The name hit her like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that knocked the air from her lungs. Vance Designs. It was the name of her father's firm. The small, brilliant, independent architectural firm he had built from the ground up. The firm that had been his life's work. The firm that had been stolen from him in a predatory acquisition that had left him bankrupt and broken. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The blueprint on the table, the mocked architect, the stolen portfolio. It was all connected. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't random. The man in the restaurant, the arrogant titan who had just fired her, was not just some cruel billionaire. He was the one. He was the architect of her family's ruin. The realization was a cataclysmic event in her soul. The years of quiet grief, of simmering resentment, of a sorrow too deep to name, all of it coalesced in that single, blinding moment into a new, terrifying, and powerful emotion: purpose. The fury she had felt earlier was a flickering candle compared to the inferno that now raged within her. This was no longer just about defending her father's honor. It was about avenging it. The man who had destroyed her family had, through his own spectacular arrogance, delivered himself right to her doorstep. He had mocked her father's work to her face, unknowingly confessing his crimes to the one person on earth who had both the knowledge to understand them and the motivation to seek justice. The last piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and the picture it revealed was one of profound, poetic irony. The descent in the service elevator was no longer a journey into despair. It was a retreat to regroup for war. The 75 floors passed in a blur. The stark, industrial metal walls of the elevator felt like armor, shielding her as she processed the monumental truth she had just uncovered. When the doors opened into the building's cavernous loading dock, she stepped out not into the cold New York night, but onto a battlefield of her own choosing. The city lights, which had seemed so menacing just moments before, now looked like a grid of possibilities, a network of information waiting to be accessed. She was no longer alone and adrift in the metropolis. She had a target, she had a mission. The feeling of powerlessness that had been her constant companion for years had been burned away, leaving behind the hardened steel of her resolve. The subway ride back to her small apartment in Queens was a study in transformation. She sat amidst the weary commuters, but she was no longer one of them. While they saw a young woman in a waitress uniform staring blankly out the window, her mind was a whirlwind of activity, replaying legal statutes, recalling contractual clauses from her father's old files, and formulating the first steps of a plan. The faces of the other passengers blurred into a backdrop for her thoughts. She was seeing the city in a new light, not as a collection of buildings, but as a web of legal and financial connections, a system of power that could be understood, navigated, and ultimately turned against itself. Finch thought he owned the city, but she knew its secrets, its hidden passages, its structural and legal weaknesses. He owned the buildings, but she owned the blueprints. Back in the quiet sanctuary of her apartment, the air thick with the smell of old books, and the faint, lingering scent of her father's pipe tobacco from years gone by, she did not allow herself to rest. The exhaustion was a distant hum, easily ignored. She walked over to a large cedar chest that sat at the foot of her bed, her father's chest, where she kept his most precious documents. She knelt and lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled among his drafting tools and personal mementos, were dozens of accordion files, each one meticulously labeled in his precise, architectural script. She pulled out the one marked Advanced Designs Acquisition, its cardboard softened with age. This was the story of his professional death, and it would become the key to her victory. She spread the contents across her small living room floor, transforming the worn rug into a war room. Blueprints, letters from lawyers, preliminary contracts, notices of default. It was all there. For hours, she sat amidst the sea of paper, her eidetic memory working with a ferocious intensity. She was not just reading the documents, she was absorbing them, connecting them, seeing the narrative that her father, in his distress, had been unable to piece together. She saw the deliberate ambiguity in the contract language, the way Finch's Shell Corporation had used a series of rapid transactions to obscure the true nature of the intellectual property transfer. It was a masterpiece of corporate predation, designed to be legally confusing and financially overwhelming for a small, independent architect to fight. She found the flaw. It was a small thing, a single clause related to the transfer of intellectual property rights for designs not yet built. A legal gray area that Finch's lawyers had ruthlessly exploited. Her father had fought it, but he had run out of money, out of time, out of hope. But now Ilara had something her father never did. She had Finch himself. She knew his current vulnerabilities, his over-leveraged position on the landmark acquisition, his public humiliation. He had made himself a target. And she knew exactly who could help her forge the weapon she needed to strike. There was only one person she could trust, a man who had not only been her mentor but had also deeply respected her father's work. With hands that were now as steady as a surgeon's, she opened her laptop. The shame she had once felt about dropping out of Yale, about disappearing from the academic world that had promised her so much, was gone. She composed an email to Professor Alistair Albright, the head of the architectural law program. It was short, precise, and professional. She laid out the core facts of the landmark bylaw, the fraudulent acquisition of the Vance Designs portfolio, and the identity of Alistair Finch. She did not ask for pity or for help. She simply asked for his opinion on a specific legal precedent regarding intellectual property fraud in the context of landmark preservation disputes. It was a query from one legal mind to another. His response came in less than 10 minutes. It wasn't an email, it was a phone call. Ilara, his voice was a warm, familiar baritone, filled with a mixture of concern and a palpable intellectual excitement. "I always knew you were destined for a case that would change the world. You found it." He listened intently as she walked him through her findings, his occasional questions sharp and insightful. He didn't just validate her theory, he strengthened it, pointing out 2 additional avenues of legal attack she hadn't yet considered. He saw the full scope of what she had uncovered, the potential to set a major legal precedent and to bring down a titan who had long been considered untouchable. Then he gave her the first concrete tool for her counterattack. "There's a man you need to see," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "His name is Julian Croft. He's the best forensic accountant in the country, a bloodhound who lives to untangle the finances of men like Finch. He owes me a rather significant favor from an old case we worked on together. I'll make the call. He'll be expecting you. A name, a contact, an ally." It was the first step, the first piece of her strategy, falling into place. She was no longer a lone woman fighting a faceless corporation. She was building a team. The professor had opened the first door for her, providing the key to a world of resources she thought she had lost forever. Ilara hung up the phone, the first glimmer of dawn streaking the sky outside her window. The long, dark night was ending. She looked at the files spread across her floor, no longer seeing them as a testament to her family's tragedy, but as an arsenal. She had a target, she had an ally, she had a plan. The rage in her heart had been forged into a purpose, cold, hard, and sharp. The invisible waitress who had served Alistair Finch his dinner was gone. In her place stood a strategist, a legal warrior, a daughter ready to reclaim her father's legacy. The hunt had begun, and the prey, sleeping soundly in his penthouse 75 stories above the city, had no idea that the foundations of his empire were already beginning to crack, undermined by the very woman he had so carelessly cast aside. The meeting with Julian Croft did not take place in a gleaming high-rise office or a mahogany-paneled study. His domain was a cramped, third-floor walk-up in the East Village, a space that seemed to exist in a different century from the rest of New York. The air inside was thick, with the scent of aging paper, stale coffee, and the faint, metallic tang of ozone from an overworked server tower humming in the corner. Mountains of manila folders and legal boxes formed precarious canyons between a scarred wooden desk and a wall of overflowing bookshelves. Julian himself was a man who seemed to have been assembled from the same materials as his office. He was thin and wiry, with a shock of untamed gray hair and eyes that peered out from behind thick, smudged glasses. Those eyes, however, were unnervingly sharp, moving with a restless intelligence that missed nothing. He listened to Ilara's story without interruption, his hands steepled beneath his chin, his expression a carefully neutral mask. He had seen 1,000 stories of corporate malfeasance, 1,000 victims seeking justice. He was a bloodhound, as the professor had said, but one grown weary of the hunt, cynical about the possibility of ever truly cornering the most powerful beasts of the financial jungle. He had seen too many righteous crusades end in quiet, out-of-court settlements or simply run out of steam against the infinite resources of men like Alistair Finch. Ilara laid out her father's files on the only clear surface available, a small, rickety table already burdened with stacks of financial reports. She spoke with the same cool precision she had used at the restaurant, walking Julian through the history of Vance Designs, the unique nature of her father's intellectual property, and the predatory structure of the acquisition contract. She pointed to the specific clauses Finch's lawyers had used to create a legal labyrinth, a maze of contingent liabilities and obscured ownership that was designed to bankrupt any small firm that dared to challenge it. As she spoke, she could feel Julian's professional skepticism beginning to thaw, replaced by a flicker of grudging respect. He was not moved by the tragedy of her story. He was too jaded for that, but by the clarity of her analysis. She was not presenting him with a tale of woe. She was presenting him with a case, a complex legal and financial puzzle that appealed to the core of his professional being. He finally picked up one of her father's original contracts, his long, thin fingers tracing the lines of text as if reading a map. "The genius of this fraud," he murmured, more to himself than to her, "is its elegance. It's almost perfectly legal on the surface." Almost. That single word hung in the dusty air, a small, hard kernel of hope. The hunt began not with a bang, but with the quiet, relentless clicking of a keyboard. Julian's office became Ilara's new world, a sanctuary of data and a war room for their silent assault. The days blurred into a grueling rhythm of analysis and cross-referencing. Julian, with his access to proprietary financial databases and his encyclopedic knowledge of corporate loopholes, began to trace the money. He dove into the murky waters of Finch Global Properties, a company structured like a Russian nesting doll of shell corporations and offshore holding entities. He followed the digital breadcrumbs from New York to Delaware, then to the Cayman Islands, and finally to a series of anonymous accounts in Switzerland and Panama. It was a deliberately convoluted path, designed to make the flow of capital untraceable, a financial fortress built to protect Finch from any form of scrutiny. Ilara worked alongside him, her role becoming far more critical than she had anticipated. While Julian saw the numbers and the transactions, she saw the motive, the underlying logic that connected the financial maneuvers to the physical assets Finch was targeting. She possessed the Rosetta Stone, her father's portfolio. Her mind, once occupied with memorizing wine pairings and table numbers, was now a battleground of legal precedents and financial data. She would spend hours staring at screens displaying complex wire transfer records, her eidetic memory allowing her to spot subtle patterns that even Julian's sophisticated software might miss. A series of small payments from a shell company in Liechtenstein, for example, seemed random until Ilara matched the dates to the preliminary zoning applications for a project her father had designed but never built. She realized Finch hadn't just stolen the finished blueprints. He had stolen the entire pipeline of future projects, using her father's own research and development as a roadmap for his acquisitions. The rage that had been a burning inferno was now a controlled, focused flame, fueling her through 18-hour days. The image of her father in his sterile hospital room was a constant presence in her mind, a silent, powerful reminder of the stakes. Every connection she made, every layer of deceit she peeled back, was a small victory, a step toward reclaiming the life that had been so brutally taken from them. They hit a wall. It was a digital fortress, a shell corporation registered in a jurisdiction with impenetrable banking secrecy laws. This company, named Argentum Holdings, appeared to be the final destination for the profits generated from her father's stolen designs. It was a black hole in the financial universe. Money went in, but no information came out. Julian leaned back in his chair, the glow of the monitor reflecting in his glasses, and let out a long, weary sigh. "This is the end of the line, Ilara," he said, his voice flat with resignation. "This is where they bury their sins. The company has no listed directors, no public records. It's a ghost. To get past this, we'd need a court order from a government that doesn't cooperate. And to get that, we'd need evidence of a crime we can't prove without getting past this." It was the perfect catch-22, the kind of legal and financial engineering that kept men like Finch untouchable. For the first time in weeks, the crushing weight of despair threatened to return, the feeling of a small boat breaking apart against the cliffs of an unassailable fortress. But Ilara refused to accept defeat. While Julian saw a dead end in the data, she saw a human element, a flaw born of arrogance. Finch was meticulous, but he was also a creature of habit and ego. She remembered his words in the restaurant, his disdain for the idiot architect. His contempt was not just a personality trait, it was a strategic blind spot. He underestimated the past, underestimated sentiment, and underestimated the very foundations of the world he sought to conquer. She turned away from the financial records and back to the physical world, to the city itself. She spent 2 days at the New York City Department of Buildings, poring over microfiche records and dusty, forgotten permit applications from the last 50 years. She was not looking for a financial crime. She was looking for a pattern, a signature, a trace of Finch's methodology before he had become a titan, back when he was just another hungry developer. She was hunting for the ghost of his younger, less careful self. Meanwhile, 75 stories above the city, Alistair Finch was becoming a man besieged by phantoms. The public humiliation at the Eyrie had done more than just scuttle a single deal. It had planted a seed of doubt among his peers, and, more importantly, within himself. The waitress, the girl who shouldn't have known anything, had exposed a flaw in his otherwise perfect machine of acquisition. The incident had made him paranoid. He felt a creeping sense of vulnerability he hadn't experienced in decades. He called his legal team, his voice a low, dangerous growl over the speakerphone. "I want a full audit of the Vance Designs acquisition. I want every file, every transaction, every email chain, triple-checked and then buried under so much legal encryption it would take a government to find it." He was not acting on a specific threat, but on a primal instinct. The ghost of the waitress had spooked him, and in his fear he began to move, to cover his tracks, unknowingly creating ripples in the very data that Ilara and Julian were trying to decipher. His paranoia became their key. In his haste to digitally shred and re-encrypt the old Vance Designs files, one of his tech teams made a small, almost undetectable error. A single server migration failed to properly purge its temporary cache. For a period of less than 90 minutes, a fragmented data packet from the original acquisition became momentarily visible to a deep-level search algorithm that Julian had running. It was a ghost in the machine, a digital echo of a conversation Finch thought he had erased forever. An alarm pinged softly on Julian's computer, a notification he would have normally dismissed as a false positive. But Ilara, returning from her research at the city archives, saw it. She looked at the garbled lines of code and the fragmented email headers. It was mostly gibberish, but 2 words, nestled among the digital noise, made her blood run cold: geological survey. It was the connection she had been hunting for. The geological survey was not a financial document or a legal contract. It was a deep-level analysis of the bedrock and foundational stability of a specific city block, the very block where her father had planned his most ambitious project, a revolutionary eco-tower that integrated into the existing historic architecture. Finch hadn't just stolen the designs. He had stolen the foundational research, the very earth upon which the dream was to be built. This survey, commissioned and paid for by her father, was the key. It was a tangible asset, a piece of physical intellectual property that was far harder to obscure than a simple wire transfer. The fragmented email confirmed that Finch's firm had taken possession of the survey data 3 days before the acquisition was even finalized. A clear-cut case of corporate espionage and theft that preceded the fraudulent contract itself. It was the first domino. Armed with this new knowledge, Julian knew exactly where to look. He was no longer searching for a hidden bank account. He was searching for a specific data file. He bypassed the financial networks and dove into the labyrinth of data storage contractors and third-party cloud services that Finch Global used. He explained to Ilara that large firms rarely keep all their data in-house. They outsource it, creating yet another layer of separation and plausible deniability. Using the date and the specific file type of the geological survey, he was able to isolate the server, and after hours of what he called digital persuasion, he found it. It was a complete, unredacted copy of her father's survey, sitting in a mislabeled folder on a forgotten server in a data farm in rural Virginia. And attached to it was something even more damning, an internal memo, written by a young Alistair Finch himself. The memo was the smoking gun. It was a cold, clinical, and brutally honest assessment of the Vance Designs portfolio. In it, Finch laid out the strategy for the acquisition. He explicitly identified the portfolio's immense value, not just in the existing designs, but in the future projects, the zoning variances her father had already secured, and the geological survey that gave him a massive competitive advantage. Most damningly, he wrote, "The Principal Vance is a creative, not a businessman. He lacks the capital and the stomach for a protracted legal fight. A low-ball offer, combined with aggressive legal pressure, should secure the entire portfolio for less than 10% of its market value." He had confessed to his entire strategy in his own words. He had admitted to targeting her father specifically because of his perceived weakness. He had documented his own crime with the same arrogant confidence he displayed in every aspect of his life. Julian Croft printed the memo, the quiet hum of the laser printer the only sound in the dusty office. He handed the warm pages to Ilara. Her hands were perfectly steady as she took them. She read Finch's words, and the face of her father, vibrant and full of life before the ruin, swam in her vision. The memo was not just evidence. It was a vindication. It was the truth, written in black and white, a testament to the fact that her father was not a failure. He was not an idiot architect. He was a brilliant man, who had been targeted and destroyed by a predator. The cold fury inside her solidified into something hard and clear as diamond. The grief was still there, a permanent resident in the architecture of her soul, but it was no longer a crippling weight. It was now the foundation of her strength, the bedrock upon which she would build her case for justice. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Ilara returned to her apartment that night, the memo clutched in her hand. She remembered something her father had told her years ago, a lesson about his own philosophy. The integrity of a structure isn't in its facade, he had said, but in its foundation. The smallest crack, hidden deep underground, can bring the whole thing down. She suddenly knew what she had to do. It wasn't enough to leak the memo to the press or file a lawsuit that would be tied up in courts for years. Finch's downfall had to be as public and as architecturally sound as the buildings her father designed. It had to happen in a place of his own making, a structure built on a foundation of lies. She looked at the invitation she had found during her research at the city archives, a public notice for a major press gala hosted by Finch Global Properties. The gala was to be held in the grand ballroom of the Eyrie, the very building where her journey had begun. Finch was set to announce his new visionary city development project, the culmination of all his work, built upon the very land and the very designs he had stolen from her father. It was an act of supreme arrogance, a victory lap in the heart of his empire. He was planning to stand on a stage and present her father's legacy as his own. The irony was so profound, so poetically just, that it felt like the hand of fate itself. He was unknowingly providing her with the perfect stage, the perfect audience, and the perfect moment to expose the cracked foundation of his entire life's work. The setting was not just a venue, it was a symbol of his hubris. She called Julian and Professor Albright, her voice calm and resolute. She laid out her plan, not as a question, but as a statement of intent. It was audacious, risky, and deeply personal. She would not be a heckler in the crowd, or a source for a journalist. She would be the main event. She would use her knowledge of the Ares architecture, not to find a service elevator, but to secure a position where she could not be ignored. She would use her legal training not to argue in a courtroom, but to prosecute him in the court of public opinion. She would present the evidence, the contract, the memo, the geological survey, in a way that was irrefutable, a logical and emotional checkmate from which he could not escape. Professor Albright, after a long silence on the phone, simply said, "Your father would be proud, Ilara. Not just because you are fighting for him, but because of how you are fighting. You are using knowledge as your weapon, integrity as your shield." Julian, for his part, began to work immediately, preparing a digital presentation of the evidence that could be deployed instantly, a visual and undeniable accompaniment to her testimony. The team was assembled, the evidence was secured, the plan was articulated, the stage for the final confrontation was set. Ilara stood before the small, cracked mirror in her apartment. The black waitress uniform lay discarded on a chair, a relic of a life that no longer existed. She was not looking at her reflection. She was looking through it, seeing the woman she was about to become. The fear was gone, burned away by the righteous fire of her purpose. She was no longer Ilara Vance, the invisible waitress, the grieving daughter, the law school dropout. She was the living legacy of her father's brilliance, the keeper of his secrets, and the architect of Alistair Finch's ruin. The hunt was over. The trial was about to begin. And the final verdict would be delivered in the glittering, gilded cage 75 stories in the sky. The grand ballroom of the Eyrie was a symphony of manufactured perfection, a space designed to make mortals feel like gods. The air hummed with the clinking of champagne flutes and the low, confident murmur of the city's elite, a soundtrack of power and influence. Light from a dozen crystal chandeliers, each one the size of a small car, fractured and danced across the polished marble floor, catching on the diamonds that adorned the necks and wrists of the guests. A sea of bespoke suits and designer gowns moved through the room, a current of wealth flowing around islands of white linen tables. At the far end of the ballroom, a large stage was set, dominated by a massive screen displaying the sleek, predatory logo of Finch Global Properties. Ilara Vance moved through this world not as a servant, but as an invited guest, though her name was on no list. She wore a simple, dark blue dress, a garment of such understated elegance that it acted as a form of camouflage, allowing her to observe without drawing attention. Beneath the fabric, her heart beat with a slow, steady, and powerful rhythm, like a drum counting down to a battle she had already won. She felt no fear, only a profound and chilling clarity, the serene calm of an architect about to perform a controlled demolition on a structure whose every weakness she knew by heart. She was not here to cause a scene. She was here to correct the record, to realign the foundations of a world thrown off balance by one man's greed. Alistair Finch took the stage to a wave of polite, yet enthusiastic applause. He stood at the podium, bathed in the warm glow of the spotlights, a portrait of success and unassailable power. He was in his element, the master of his universe, looking out over a crowd of his peers, his investors, and the press who chronicled his every triumph. He spoke with his signature blend of visionary rhetoric and casual condescension, outlining his new grand project, a sweeping redevelopment that he promised would redefine the city's skyline for the next century. He spoke of progress, of innovation, of a future he was single-handedly building. He did not know that he was standing on a stage built over a fault line, delivering his own eulogy. As he concluded his speech, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips, he opened the floor for questions. His eyes scanned the room, looking for a friendly face from a major publication. It was then that he saw her. Ilara was walking, not to a microphone in the aisle, but directly toward the low steps that led to the stage. A hush began to spread through the room as people turned to watch her slow, deliberate advance. Finch's smirk faltered, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He recognized the waitress, the ghost from his dinner, but the woman approaching him now wore an aura of authority that was utterly alien. Security guards started to move, but she held up a hand, a small, simple gesture that was so full of confidence it stopped them in their tracks. She ascended the 2 short steps to the stage and walked to the second podium, the one reserved for guest speakers. The silence in the ballroom was now absolute, a heavy, expectant void. Finch stared at her, his face a mixture of disbelief and growing fury. "Who the hell are you?" he managed to hiss, his voice low but carrying in the stillness. Ilara adjusted the microphone, the small sound echoing through the vast room. She did not look at him. She looked out at the audience, at the sea of powerful faces, at the journalists whose pens were poised and whose cameras were now all trained on her. "My name is Ilara Vance," she said, her voice calm, clear, and resonant, carrying to every corner of the room without any hint of strain. It was the voice of a lecturer, a prosecutor, a woman in complete command of her facts. I am here tonight on behalf of the estate of Robert Vance, the founder and sole creative force behind the architectural firm known as Vance Designs. The name, her name, hung in the air. To most in the room it meant nothing. But to Alistair Finch it was the sound of a key turning in the lock of a tomb he thought he had sealed forever. The blood began to drain from his face as he finally, truly, understood the magnitude of the ghost that had come back to haunt him. Mr. Finch has just presented you with a bold vision for the future of this city, Alara continued, her tone even and professional. A vision built on a portfolio of designs he has claimed as his own. But foundations matter. And the foundation of Finch Global Properties, the very bedrock of the empire he stands upon today, is not innovation. It is theft. As she spoke the word, she gave a subtle nod to a man standing near the audiovisual booth at the back of the room. It was Julian Croft. On the massive screen behind Finch, the sleek corporate logo of his company dissolved, replaced instantly by a high-resolution scan of a blueprint. It was her father's elegant, hand-drawn design for the Eco Tower, his signature clearly visible in the bottom corner. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Before they could fully process the image, it was replaced by another, a copy of the predatory acquisition contract, with the impossibly low purchase price and the fraudulent intellectual property clauses highlighted in red. The room erupted in a flurry of whispers and the frantic clicking of camera shutters. Finch spun around, his face ashen, staring at the evidence of his crimes broadcasted for the entire world to see. He turned back to the microphone, his hand trembling as he gripped the podium. This is a fabrication," he stammered, his voice losing its confident timbre, becoming thin and reedy. "This is a baseless accusation from a disgruntled former employee." He was trying to regain control, to cast her as a hysterical woman, a liar. But Alara was already 2 steps ahead. She gave another, almost imperceptible nod to Julian. The contract on the screen vanished, and in its place appeared the final, irrefutable exhibit, the internal memo. Finch's own words, written years ago, filled the screen, magnified 20 feet high. "The Principal Vance is a creative, not a businessman. He lacks the capital and the stomach for a protracted legal fight. A lowball offer, combined with aggressive legal pressure, should secure the entire portfolio for less than 10% of its market value." The words were a confession, a signed and dated monument to his own greed and cruelty. The whispers in the room died, replaced by a stunned, damning silence. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. It was the truth, in black and white, authored by the villain himself. Alistair Finch had been executed by his own hand. The Titan did not roar, he crumbled. The carefully constructed facade of Alistair Finch, the invincible master of the universe, disintegrated under the weight of his own words. He stared at the memo, his mouth slightly agape, a low, guttural sound escaping his throat. It was the sound of a man watching his entire world burn to the ground. He looked out at the audience, but he no longer saw peers and admirers. He saw judges. He saw the cold, calculating eyes of investors already on their phones, their fingers flying as they instructed their brokers to sell, to short, to abandon the sinking ship. He saw the predatory grins of the journalists, who smelled the biggest corporate scandal of the decade. He saw his rivals, barely concealing their schadenfreude. He tried to speak again, to offer a defense, but no words came. His power, which had always resided in his voice, in his ability to command and control, had utterly abandoned him. He was just a man, small and exposed, trapped in the glare of the spotlights on a stage that had become his pillory. The strength seemed to drain from his legs, and he stumbled back a step, grabbing the podium to keep from falling. His empire was gone. His reputation was ashes. In the space of 5 minutes, Alara Vance had not just defeated him, she had erased him. Type justice, In the comments, if you got chills when Alistair Finch's own words appeared on that screen, sealing his fate in front of the entire world. The weeks that followed the gala were a cascade of consequences. Finch Global Properties imploded in a way that was spectacular, even by the dramatic standards of Wall Street. The stock plummeted to zero. Federal investigators swarmed the offices, and a dozen class action lawsuits were filed by defrauded investors. Alistair Finch, stripped of his assets and facing a battery of criminal charges, became a pariah, a cautionary tale whispered in the boardrooms he once commanded. But Ilara was not watching the news. She was in a quiet, sunlit room at the best long-term care facility in the state, sitting beside her father. The weight of financial worry had been lifted, replaced by the simple, profound peace of being able to provide for him without desperation. She read him a story, not from a newspaper detailing Finch's fall, but from one of his favorite books on architectural history. As she read, his hand, which had been still for so long, twitched and then closed around hers. She looked up and saw him looking at her, a flicker of the old light, the old brilliance in his eyes. A single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek. He could not speak the words, but she heard them all the same. He knew, and he was proud. Her own future, once a path that had vanished into fog, was now a brightly lit avenue. The week after the gala, she received a call from the managing partner of Sterling & Royce, the most respected architectural preservation firm in the country, a firm Finch had spent years trying to acquire and dismantle. They did not offer her a job, they offered her a purpose. They had seen her performance at the gala not as an act of revenge, but as a brilliant legal and moral defense of architectural integrity. They created a new position for her, Director of Legacy Acquisitions. Her role was not to strip assets, but to find, protect, and preserve the work of brilliant but vulnerable architects, just like her father. She would wield her unique knowledge of law and structure as a shield, protecting the city's soul from the predators who saw it only as a commodity. She accepted, and in doing so, stepped fully into the woman she was always meant to be. Her family's name, once a source of pain and ruin, was now a symbol of integrity and resilience, honored in the very industry that had tried to cast it aside. If Ilara's incredible journey from an unseen servant to an unstoppable force of justice inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see that knowledge is the one power that can never be taken away. And for more unforgettable stories of righteous vindication and the triumph of the human spirit, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a moment when the truth finally comes to light.